Okay, so I'm not a cognitive scientist, so I'm working in kind of unfamiliar territory here. But even if I don't know anything about what I'm about to say, I got to share the stage with Ward, so I'm already in good shape. The right side of my brain helps me make things rhyme. The left side keeps it all in time. What's in between helps me learn and perceive, believe that I have the answers I need. Ours is a culture of logic and reason, but do the ones and zeros truly have meaning? Does your software have feelings? Stay tuned. You may find this revealing. Work harder, they said. You can rest when you're dead. What is the opportunity cost of this lack of mental floss? So many questions and no time for thought. Maybe you should sleep on it. Let rapid eye movements give way to improvements. Solutions reduced to abstract illusions. Fast asleep and hard at work. Generate painless solutions. So we've chosen our tools. We've lined our minds with patterns of design. Muscle memory translates brain waves to square braces and a faint blue glow on end users' faces. But blue glows become blue screens and Sad Max bombs and disasters. Did we fail to think or fail to see? Or were we just told, work faster? 5 times we ask why when things went awry. Why? Because the computer does what you tell it to. Why? Because the analysis was done by fools. Why? This solution doesn't follow the rules. Why? Well, we missed an opportunity for code reuse. Why? Maybe the end user was just confused. Relax. Your mind is hard at work, maintaining focus. A puzzle piece is placed precisely, with you unaware of its locus. But the joke is, a computer walks into a bar, or crashed into the surface of Mars because you told it to. Think twice, code once, and you'll go far. So who am I? I'm Bill Chapman. I'm the development lead at a company called Academic Software Plus. Our parent company is Liaison International. We write academic software for admissions, mostly for the health professions. This is my 4th or 5th year at Mountain West, but I've never spoken before, so Mike, longtime listener, first-time caller, big fan of the show. I consider myself a professional thinker. And currently, my most important role, I think, is as a team mentor. As a team lead, I spend most of my days as a co-pilot. So who is Janie? Well, Janie's at home with my wife watching this presentation. She appears to run on intuition. And trust me, Janie thinks she's an expert in everything. And I'm probably going to get a lot of feedback from her when I get home tomorrow. But one thing is that experts tend to have a hard time resisting the urge to always work on intuition. In pragmatic thinking and learning, Andy Hunt talks a lot about the Dreyfus Model. It's a model of how individuals acquire skill. And it lists the certain levels as novice, advanced beginner, competent, proficient, and expert. And what's interesting about this model is they assert that most people never get beyond the advanced beginner state in this model. So novice, advanced beginner, competent. Most people are subcompetent at most things. If you couple this with the Dunning-Kruger effect, that's where people who are inexperienced tend to think they're better at something than they actually are. You get an interesting situation. Consider that for any given problem, well, let's back up a second. Most of the people in this room, for most things, are probably just advanced beginners. And for any given problem that you have not yet solved, you're not yet an expert. Otherwise, you already would have solved it. So there's a couple of reasons I propose this talk. And one is that often as a founder for many of the projects that I work on, someone who's written a lot of the original code, I've often thought about many of the solutions that I'm delegating today. And I find that I have a hard time delegating when I've got possibly 2 years of thinking already going into the problem. And now I have to let one of my other developers kind of catch up to this. And I noticed that, this may be something that I worked on for an hour 2 years ago. Why do I all of a sudden have clarity when I haven't actually thought about it? I also find that I get frustrated when I'm working in a capacity as a manager because, how many of us have said, oh, that'll take me 15 minutes? And then maybe you delegate this role, you ask somebody else to get some coding done for you, and it takes 3 or 4 days. And you may remember when you did it recently, and it took you 5 minutes to do it, or it took you 3 hours to do it. But what you're neglecting is the fact that you probably thought about it for a long time. I have things where I will sit down and completely forget about the 4 months I spent thinking about a problem, and then implement it in 2 days, and, oh yeah, it took me 2 days. Did it? Not really. So, who might benefit from this discussion? This is the master gaming race, if anybody's familiar with them. Well, programmers, people other than programmers, our managers, our coworkers, I think that there's a lot of miscommunication about what we do for a living and how we get things done. And there's also a small group of programmers that I'd like to call out. The freshmen. So we've probably all worked with the freshmen, or we've been the freshmen. An example from an interview we did recently. The code worked great, and I couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. And I realized it looked like a freshman CS 101 project. You can just tell when somebody doesn't think through a problem completely. Also, we had a prospective new hire, and we give this Ruby code quiz, and we give them a test suite. But the test suite doesn't necessarily have all of the questions solved. It's not necessarily asking all the questions you need to ask to get that thing done. We really want to see if they think through the problem. Just assuming that, well, we passed all the tests, this must be good software. That's the kind of thing the freshmen might do. And here's some code the freshmen might write. And what's interesting about this is it's actually code I wrote as a freshman in the 90s, right? I had to retrieve it from a floppy. Has anyone in here never had to save anything to a floppy? What's interesting about this is it doesn't look like horrible code, but I have this big block of ASCII art. Well, it turned out that the whole project looked like that. I probably spent more time writing these ridiculous interfaces than I did actually making the code work. And it was like a bug light for my professor, like, pay no attention to the code over here, but look at this. And I think one of the deficiencies that the freshman has is they have not yet really learned to think through a problem. They don't see what's important. I clearly didn't know what was important. They weren't grading me on whatever that is. Another programmer type that might benefit here is Mrs. Roberts. Mrs. Roberts often patches a problem because they think the bigger issue is too complex or potentially unsolvable. This approach tends to create gremlins in the code base. Those gremlins you could probably call Bobby Tables Jr. These developers look productive to management because they're always working and they're always solving problems, but nobody really realizes that they're always solving the same problem. And here's some code that this individual might write. It looks like they had some method missing errors and they just decided to sweep them under the rug. The Bob Ross fan. I love Bob Ross. I used to fashion my entire development style after Bob Ross. You just keep throwing code at the page and eventually you end up with something that works. No one else really knows what they're up to, and they just keep throwing layers of code at the page, and it's difficult for anybody else to see the big picture. And, here's some code that, wait, did it go? Oh yeah, here's some code that Bob Ross might write. There's all these happy little methods, and what's interesting here is it's hard to find an example of this style of code because the end result is often deceptive. It's got some weird bugs in it because of all the layers. In this case, there's some the most telling thing would probably be to sit behind them for about an hour and then press Control or Command Z and undo all of the changes and just watch all the code go back and forth. Their deficiency is that they don't spend so much time thinking about their solution as much as just chasing their intuitive vision. This guy I talk about all the time, this developer, the mercenary, they're somehow able to shut their brain off at 5 p.m. They don't really care about what language they're using. Whatever pays well really works for them. And here's some code that the mercenary might write. You probably can't see that, but what's interesting is that it's Ruby. Sort of. Yeah, thank you. It kind of looks more like PHP or Java. And the thing about the mercenary is that they care more about doing the job than using the right tool or really learning the tools they're using. The mercenary might actually list Ruby expert on his resume and still write code that looks like this. And then, finally, and this is dangerous territory for me as a development manager because sometimes I might fall into this mode, but the pointy-eared boss doesn't always understand what you're doing. If he's like me and he's got lots of experience, he might think, well, why can't you get that done faster? Because he's neglecting all the thinking that went into it when he did it the first time. The pointy-eared boss also thinks he knows what working looks like. And we're going to talk a little more about what working looks like. He also wants to quantify what you do. Let's see the last code pointy-eared boss wrote. So, their deficiency is that they often focus on irrelevant metrics, and they don't really know that we think for a living, and they don't know what thinking looks like. It's hard to put a dollar value on your thoughts. So let's get to the point already. We're professional thinkers. I don't think that's a stretch. And thinking happens everywhere. It follows us home, it invades us in the shower, it interrupts us in conversations, it comes to dinner, much to the chagrin of our significant others. Thinking is really what we're getting paid to do, and personally, I think coding's the easy part. We spend a lot of time honing our code craft. We learn new programming languages, we discuss esoteric points of frameworks, we do code katas, but are we spending enough time keeping all of the right tools sharp? Are we keeping our minds healthy? Also, the best place for thinking is not necessarily the best place for coding, and I kind of want to get into that too. Have you ever tried to code in the shower? I do a lot of really good thinking there, but I'm not bringing my MacBook in there. So are we providing ourselves with the best environment for getting our job done? Are our employers, are our clients, do our clients understand? So I think it might be a little clearer now that I'm not talking about waterfall. This has nothing to do with Agile or waterfall development or big upfront design. My team, I actually think, is a pretty good Agile team. I don't even know what Agile means, but I think my team is pretty good at the important parts of it, and that's what matters. So this is more about giving ourselves time to think, doing our thinking at the right time, understanding that unconscious thought has value, and factoring it into our plans and our specifications. The end result of both active and passive thought is not necessarily going to be some kind of waterfall situation. So how do I get you to agree with me? And, I totally forgot to put a sombrero on this. So I think there's plenty of kind of odd precedent in the industry that we're thinkers. You think about architecture roles for our best thinkers. We're starting to realize that you get to a point where you just can't push everybody into management just because they're, in my case, 35. But we need to understand that. Companies are realizing this. You think about TDD style. Well, this is a great example. You can think of TDD as thought-driven development, right, where you're focusing on solutions and outcomes and kind of directing the development before you actually write your system code. And this one's kind of evil, but employment agreements. I don't know if anyone's ever signed one. I personally haven't, but there are these employment agreements that are pretty pervasive in some areas of the industry where employers are actually saying they want you to sign over that they own any code that you've written at any time. Day or night, it doesn't matter. And what they're really saying is that we are paying for your thoughts, all of your thoughts whenever they occur. As soon as they manifest themselves as code on the page, we own them. So I'm a programmer, right? So I'm really good at getting up and talking about what I think, or at least what I think, or, but let's assume that I've won you over. Let's assume that you believe me and we're thinkers and that's what we need to focus on. Well, let's see what other thinkers have to say about this. This is Poincaré. Poincaré was a pretty decent mathematician. The Poincaré conjecture was one of the Millennium Prizes. So he was thinking about some pretty difficult stuff. And it's often written that Poincaré would work from 10 to 12 in the late morning and then work again from 5 to 7 in the evening, never working more than 4 hours a day. And he said that he found that it just wasn't useful to work any more than that. He couldn't do the type of thinking he had to do and continue these long work days. So that's anecdotal at best, but recent research from out of Florida State University studied people who excel in their fields, mathematicians or musicians, elite chess players, actors, and it found that in general, the people who tended to excel, the elites, had different patterns of work. And it seemed like it was 90 minutes at a time with nice long breaks, rarely working more than 4.5 hours a day. And this is interesting because it has ramifications to how we work in the office. If this research asserts that every 90 minutes we have a point where we hit a mental fatigue and we really need to kind of reboot. But what does reboot mean? It means having a conversation. It means doing something else other than intense thought or intense focus. And our coworkers may not understand why we have our Nerf guns in the office at the ready or why we occasionally fly a small blimp around the office. Because we need to take a break every 90 minutes. So also, we know that under some circumstances, there's research that shows conscious thought deteriorates in quality over long periods of time. So I want to kind of get to my first question. Are you working too much? So 4.5 hours a day doesn't really seem like much time to get any work done, does it? Not with our lives, right? So there's been a great deal of research in unconscious cognition, and I'm sure we've mostly all experienced this, right? Have you ever fallen asleep trying to figure out who that actor on Doctor Who was, and you wake up the next morning and go, oh yeah, I remember their name. It's because your brain was working on the problem when you were asleep. There was an apartment study a study about this, and they used apartments, and they took these listings of apartments, and one of them was significantly better than the rest, but it was subtle. It wasn't in ways that would just jump out at you. So the subjects were asked to either choose immediately which was the best apartment, or choose after some period of goofing off. And it turns out that the subjects that were asked to choose after goofing off chose the right apartment almost twice as much as those that were asked to kind of guess right away. But this is kind of interesting because it tells us that your brain was working on the problem even though you were engaged in other activities. And, how do you explain that to your other coworkers or to your clients? How do you even bill for that if you're a consultant? So my next question is, we're always working on some problems whether we like it or not. We have no choice in the matter. There's another study similar. Subjects were asked to recall a list of words. the subjects that were asked to recall the words after 8 hours of waking relaxation did significantly worse than the subjects that were asked to recall the words after 8 hours of sleep. So, wait, here's another question. You mean even when we're asleep, we are still working and possibly harder on some problems? So we're talking about thinking and kind of how your brain's working when you're not actively engaged in something, but what about when you're actually getting things done? Well, other research implies that there is a divide between the thinking mindset and the doing mindset, and that you can only really be in one state at a time. So furthermore, some individuals spend more time in one state than the other. So if this is true, maybe we shouldn't try to fight our current state and choose our tasks that fit whatever our mental mode is right now. A question here would be, how do we optimize our mental state for the task at hand? Pair programming, for example, where one is maybe the doer and one is maybe the thinker, things like that. How do we integrate this into an environment? And how do we allocate our teams based on the state of mind that they're currently in? So what about when we're actively working? Many of you have probably heard of Miller's Law. It says we can put 7 things, plus or minus 2, in memory, in working memory at any given time. But programmers routinely solve problems with hundreds or even thousands of variables in them. So the question here is, if we can only have finite working memory space, how can we possibly keep track of hundreds or thousands of variables? I'm going to skip this slide because I'm running shorter. So it was just a reiteration of the previous slide. So what we're really talking about is problem solving. And problem solving could be thought of as a feedback loop of think, learn, and then apply. So learning is a pretty important part of thinking in what we do, anyways, because we're problem solvers. And I started out with an assertion that for any given unsolved problem, you're unlikely to be an expert in that problem. So if that's true, then you need to realize that you need to learn something before you can get to the solution you're looking for. So the question here is, considering that learning is a key part of problem solving, what can we do to make sure we are providing ourselves with a good learning environment? Several studies assert that activating more of the brain while engaged in an activity or in thought increases mental productivity. So even if the extra activity is something like drumming on a desk or thumping your foot, it shows that it actually helps. So it doesn't have to have anything to do, spinning a pen with your hand. And music is an excellent multisensory stimulant. And research shows that surgeons performed better when listening to music that they enjoyed. Also, a friend of mine is involved in a program called Fresh Prep, where he wrote a bunch of hip-hop style lyrics to global studies classes. And they took a selection of students that had failed the Global Studies Regents exam 5 or more times, and then they gave them a 12-day course where they learned global studies through hip-hop. And yeah, very interesting. 79% of them passed. Those that have failed 5 or more times before that, including 100% of those with special needs or disabilities. In pragmatic thinking and learning, Andy Hunt also talks about a situation where they had a team that was struggling to spec out a system actually act the system out. Literally, everyone picked a role, and, oh, you're this object, and they were running across the hallway. That's also anecdotal, but it was interesting. So, question here is, what can we do to augment our approach to problem solving? This is a wild card here, but neurogenesis is the ability to regrow brain cells, right? And we always think that as we age, our brains decline and we don't regrow cells. That's what research used to indicate. But it turns out that in recent studies with lab mice, it had nothing to do with age. The studies showed that it had to do with the environment that the mice were in, and mice that were in active, enriching environments actually were able to grow brain cells, regenerate brain cells, and have more healthy minds as they aged. So the question here is, does constant exposure to dull, repetitive environments sound anything like your workplace? We're sorry, Mario. The answers are in another castle. I don't have any answers for you. All I have is a bunch of questions. And that's kind of the point, right? If we're talking about thinking. But, you know, I do have a couple of points that I'd like to make, or some things that could kind of help you along the way. There's a technique called the 5 whys. And when you have a question or a problem you're trying to solve, research shows that if you ask yourself why and give iterative answers, usually 5 iterations is enough to get to the bottom of the problem. In this case, I noticed that I often stop too soon, or I guess it would say Miss Roberts from our Bobby Tables example often stops too soon. Also, returning to the Poincaré example, his 4 hours of work is probably 4 hours of fairly intense thought. And if we're in a working mode, it doesn't mean we're ready to code. So try to be aware of your current mental modes and assign your tasks appropriately. I personally know that I'm much better at coding from 8 until midnight than I am at 9 in the morning. So in my capacity as a manager, 9 to 5 kind of works because I'm thinking, I'm pair programming, I'm co-piloting, I'm doing more of the thought work. But when I was a programmer, well, I'm still a programmer, but when I was always coding all the time, it was really frustrating if I had to go into an office all day because I wanted to work at night. That was when my brain was ready to go. My belief is that it had to settle down a bit. I had to be ready to stop thinking before I could actually code. Stop taking on too much. This one should be obvious, right? Just because you can finish one project in 1 month does not mean you can finish 6 projects concurrently in 6 months. Recognize environmental constructs. If mental health has a lot to do with the environment you're in, we may need to take better consideration at the environments we're working in. And also, sleep on it. This doesn't mean taking a nap. It means taking a walk. Talk about the last episode of Eureka. Stare out the window blankly, do something that is not active coding, and do it all the time. Give your brain a chance to catch up to your code. So, we have a lot of decisions to make every day, like which restroom to use. And I think you'll see that a little careful analysis can go a long way. So these are some of the books I used for this talk. Actually, they're all pretty good. Eric Ivancic is a friend of mine, and he did a great talk at RubyConf a few years back called Effective and Creative Coding. All my images were Wikimedia Commons or XKCD, and I don't have any answers, which means you probably shouldn't ask me any questions. So I've got time for a couple of answers if anybody has any. All right, thank you.